December 22, 1944, 5:45 in the morning, the Belgian winter pressed down on Bastogne like a fist wrapped in frozen steel. In a makeshift command post, a cellar beneath what remained of the Heinz barracks, Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe stood before a cracked mirror, his breath visible in the subterranean cold. His fingers, stiff with frostbite's early warning, fumbled with the buttons of his field jacket. The fabric was stained with the grime of 6 days under siege, 6 days of holding a dying town against the full fury of the German Wehrmacht. Outside, in the pre-dawn darkness, 11,000 American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division waited. They waited in foxholes filled with ice water. They waited behind barricades constructed from rubble and frozen corpses. They waited with ammunition counts measured in single digits, with bellies gnawing on their own emptiness, with feet blackening in boots never designed for this kind of cold. They waited because a week earlier they had been told to hold this crossroads town for 24 hours. That deadline had passed 144 hours ago. The mirror before McAuliffe reflected more than his unshaven face. It reflected the impossible arithmetic of war. Surrounding Bastogne, 5 German divisions, the 2nd Panzer, the Panzer Lehr, the 26th Volksgrenadier, the 5th Fallschirmjäger, and elements of the Führer Begleit Brigade. Perhaps 50,000 men, 300 tanks, artillery batteries that could reduce the town to powder if given the order. Against this, 11,000 paratroopers without winter clothing, without adequate medical supplies, without armor support, and with ammunition rationing that meant each rifle had perhaps 30 rounds remaining. The math was simple, brutal, and entirely in favor of the Germans. Yet McAuliffe had already made his decision. He had made it days ago when the German pincers first closed around Bastogne during Hitler's audacious Ardennes offensive. The operation that American intelligence had dismissed as impossible, that Eisenhower had deemed unlikely, that the weather had seemed too terrible to permit. The Germans had come anyway through the fog and snow, through the supposedly impassable forests, and now they controlled every road leading out of this crossroads town. What the Germans did not control, could not control, was the spirit of the men McAuliffe commanded. 6 days earlier, on December 16th, Private First Class James Henderson of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had been eating breakfast in a warm mess hall in Mourmelon-le-Grand, France. Powdered eggs, real coffee, white bread with butter. The previous 72 days, since the nightmare of Operation Market Garden in Holland, had been spent in what the Army called rest and refit. Translation: hot showers, clean uniforms, sleep in actual beds, and the kind of food that didn't come in olive drab cans marked with dates from 1942. Henderson was 21 years old. He had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, landed in a tree, cut himself down while German machine gun fire chewed the branches around him, and fought for 33 days straight until the breakout from the bocage. He had jumped into Holland in September, watched his battalion lose 40% of its strength in 9 days, and learned that bridges could become graveyards when the tanks you were promised never arrived. He had seen enough death to fill several lifetimes, and the word going around Mourmelon was that the 101st wouldn't see combat again until spring at the earliest. Then the trucks arrived, dozens of them appearing at the camp at 0400 on December 18th. No warning, no preparation, no explanation beyond a terse order. Full combat load. Wheels roll in 1 hour. Henderson grabbed his M1 Garand, his ammunition belts, 4 clips, 32 rounds total, his helmet, his jump boots, and climbed into a truck with 49 other paratroopers. None of them knew where they were going. Most assumed it was another training exercise, some brass hat scheme to keep them sharp during the winter lull. The truth became apparent as the convoy rolled north through the Ardennes forest. They passed columns of American soldiers moving in the opposite direction, not retreating in good order, but fleeing in panic. Entire companies without officers, stragglers from a dozen different divisions, men who had thrown away their rifles and helmets and anything else that might slow their escape. Henderson watched a major, his uniform caked in mud and blood, standing at a crossroads and screaming at anyone who would listen. They came through the trees, thousands of them, Tiger tanks as far as you could see, We never had a chance. The sergeant riding in Henderson's truck, a veteran named Kozlowski who had earned a Silver Star at Normandy, watched this chaos with an expression of disgust. "Look at them," he said, "running like rabbits. We're going the wrong goddamn direction." Someone asked if they should turn around. Kozlowski spat over the side of the truck. "We're the 101st Airborne. We don't run. We jump in and we hold." They reached Bastogne at 2300 hours on December 18th. The town was already under artillery fire. The civilian population, perhaps 2,000 souls, had taken to their cellars. The previous American defenders, a scattered collection of engineers and artillery units, we are preparing to evacuate. General McAuliffe, who had arrived hours earlier with his staff, countermanded the evacuation order. "We hold here," he announced. "This is a road junction. 7 highways converge on this town. If the Germans take it, they can resupply their spearheads and push all the way to Antwerp. If we hold it, we cut their offensive in half. So we hold it." Henderson spent that first night digging a foxhole in the frozen ground east of town. The earth resisted the shovel like concrete. After 2 hours of work, he had managed to excavate perhaps 18 inches of depth, enough to provide cover from shrapnel, not enough to provide warmth or comfort. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. None of the paratroopers had winter clothing. They wore the same lightweight uniforms they had been issued for the September jump into Holland. Thin cotton, designed for autumn weather, utterly inadequate for a Belgian winter. By December 20th, the encirclement was complete. German forces controlled every road, every trail, every possible escape route. The 101st Airborne was alone, surrounded by an enemy force that outnumbered them 5-1 and outgunned them by margins that defied calculation. The siege had begun. The Germans expected surrender. Their intelligence had provided accurate counts of American strength, accurate assessments of American supply levels, accurate maps of American defensive positions. The mathematics, from their perspective, were irrefutable. The Americans were trapped, outnumbered, outgunned, freezing, starving, and running out of ammunition. Surrender was not merely the logical choice, it was the only choice. On the morning of December 22nd, at approximately 11:30 hours, 2 German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried a formal surrender ultimatum typed on official Wehrmacht stationery, signed by General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps. The document was written in elaborate military prose, invoking concepts of honor and military necessity. Its essence, stripped of diplomatic language, was simple: surrender now and be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, or resist further and face annihilation. The German officers were escorted, blindfolded, to McAuliffe's command post. The general was not present when they arrived. He had gone forward to inspect the defensive positions around Marvy, a village on Bastogne's southeastern perimeter. His operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, accepted the surrender demand and sent a runner to fetch McAuliffe. McAuliffe returned at noon. He read the German ultimatum once, his expression unchanging. Then he read it again. His staff watched in silence, waiting for the response that would determine whether 11,000 men lived as prisoners or died as soldiers. The room smelled of dampness and cigarette smoke and the particular staleness that accumulates in cellars sealed against artillery fire. What happened next would become legend, though the precise details remain contested by historians. According to the most common account, McAuliffe read the surrender demand, crumpled the paper, tossed it on a desk, and said, "Aw, nuts." It was not a calculated response, not a carefully considered diplomatic statement, but a spontaneous expression of contempt so perfectly American in its bluntness that his staff immediately recognized its brilliance. Lieutenant Colonel Kinnard, recognizing the historical significance of the moment, suggested that nuts should be the official written reply. McAuliffe agreed. A response was drafted, typed on a salvaged German typewriter, and prepared for delivery to the waiting enemy officers. The final text read, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." The German officers, when presented with this response, were baffled. The idiom nuts had no equivalent in their language, no clear translation that preserved its meaning. One of them asked for clarification. The American officer escorting them back to German lines, Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, provided an interpretation that was simultaneously helpful and insulting. "It means," Harper explained, "the same as go to hell. And I'll tell you something else. If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." The German officers departed. The ultimatum had been rejected. Negotiations, such as they were, had concluded. What remained was the business of killing and dying. Private Henderson learned of McAuliffe's response that afternoon. The story spread through the defensive perimeter like fire through dry grass. The general had told the Germans to go to hell, had rejected surrender with a single word, had chosen death over submission. Henderson, crouched in his foxhole with 3 rounds remaining in his rifle and hands so numb he could barely feel his trigger finger, found himself laughing. It was the kind of laughter that emerges from exhaustion and fear and the recognition that sometimes, in the midst of absolute horror, someone manages to say exactly the right thing. "Nuts," Henderson repeated to himself. The man said nuts. It was perfect. It was defiant without being bombastic, dismissive without being cruel, American without being vulgar. It said, "We will not negotiate, we will not surrender, and we find your threats more amusing than frightening." It said, "You may kill us, but you will not break us." The German response came at 1600 hours. Artillery shells began falling on Bastogne at a rate that exceeded anything the defenders had yet experienced. The bombardment continued for 2 hours without pause. Buildings that had survived 6 days of siege collapsed into rubble. Civilians died in cellars that proved less protective than they had hoped. The American casualty stations, already overwhelmed with wounded from previous days, filled beyond capacity. At 1800 hours, as darkness fell, the German ground attack began. Panzer tanks, infantry formations, flamethrower teams, the full weight of the 47th Panzer Corps thrown against the American perimeter. The fighting was intimate and savage. Henderson, his 3 rounds carefully rationed, waited until German soldiers were within 50 feet before firing. Each shot had to count. Each shot had to kill. There was no ammunition for warning fire, no bullets to waste on suppression or intimidation. By midnight, the German attack had stalled. The Americans had held, though barely. Casualties were severe, perhaps 300 dead or wounded in 6 hours of fighting. Ammunition levels were now critical. Most riflemen had fewer than 5 rounds remaining. Machine gun crews were down to their last belts. Mortar teams were out of shells entirely. The situation was unsustainable. If the Germans attacked again tomorrow with the same intensity, Bastogne would fall. Then, at 0200 on December 23rd, the weather changed. For 6 days, the Ardennes had been shrouded in fog and snow, conditions that grounded Allied aircraft and gave the Germans freedom of movement. Meteorologists had predicted the bad weather would continue through Christmas. They were wrong. On the morning of December 23rd, the clouds broke. Sunlight, actual sunlight, warm and brilliant, flooded across the frozen landscape. Visibility extended for miles. The sky, for the first time since the siege began, was clear. At 0900, the first C-47 transport planes appeared over Bastogne. They flew in formations, dozens of aircraft, each one carrying bundles of supplies suspended from parachutes. The drop zone was marked with colored panels laid out in the snow, orange for ammunition, white for medical supplies, red for food. The Germans, recognizing what was happening, directed every available anti-aircraft gun at the transport planes. Several were hit, trailing smoke as they struggled to maintain altitude. But most of the drops were successful. Parachutes, red and white and green and yellow, filled the sky like strange flowers blooming in winter. Henderson watched from his foxhole as bundles landed within 20 yards of his position. He and 3 other paratroopers ran forward, dragged the containers back to their line, and opened them with the desperate efficiency of men who understood that survival depended on speed. Inside, ammunition. Not the miserly 5-round allotments they had been rationing for days, but boxes of cartridges, thousands of rounds, enough to actually fight. There were also medical supplies, morphine, bandages, plasma, and food. Real food, Canned meat, chocolate bars, cigarettes, even coffee. The psychological impact of the resupply exceeded its material value. For 6 days, the defenders of Bastogne had felt abandoned, forgotten by the army they served, left to die in a frozen Belgian town that most Americans could not locate on a map. The appearance of those transport planes, the sight of those parachutes, the physical evidence that someone, somewhere, remembered their existence and was trying to help, it transformed despair into defiance. The clear weather also permitted fighter-bomber support. P-47 Thunderbolts appeared over the battlefield, their guns and bombs tearing into German armor and artillery positions. German tank columns, which had operated with impunity during the foggy conditions, now found themselves exposed and vulnerable. The Wehrmacht, which had enjoyed complete tactical superiority for 6 days, suddenly confronted an enemy that could see them, target them, and kill them from distances that made counterfire impossible. Yet the siege was not broken. The Germans still controlled the roads. The Americans were still surrounded. Supplies were better, morale was higher, but the fundamental situation remained unchanged. 11,000 paratroopers, alone in a town increasingly reduced to rubble, facing an enemy that had the numbers and firepower to overwhelm them through sheer attrition. What the Germans needed, Henderson realized, was patience. They could afford to wait, to continue the siege, to let cold and casualties erode American strength until resistance became impossible. What the Americans needed was a miracle. They needed someone to break through the encirclement from outside. They needed armor, infantry divisions, overwhelming force capable of smashing through German lines and reaching Bastogne before the defenders' strength gave out completely. They needed General George S. Patton. Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr., commander of the Third Army, was 70 miles south of Bastogne when the German offensive began. His army, over 250,000 men, 4 armored divisions, 6 infantry divisions, had been driving east toward the German border, preparing for a winter offensive that would, in Patton's estimation, end the war by February. Then Eisenhower summoned him to Verdun for an emergency meeting. The Germans had broken through in the Ardennes. Multiple American divisions had been overrun or were in full retreat. The entire Allied position in Belgium was threatened. Eisenhower needed Patton to abandon his offensive, turn his army 90 degrees north, and counterattack into the German flank. How soon could Third Army move? Patton's reply was characteristically bold. December 22nd, 3 divisions. The other generals in the room thought he was joking or lying. Turning an army of that size in winter across roads clogged with retreating units while maintaining combat readiness, it was theoretically possible but practically impossible. It would require superhuman logistics, perfect weather, and a level of staff coordination that even the German Wehrmacht, famous for its operational flexibility, would struggle to achieve. Patton did it. Third Army executed what military historians would later call one of the most remarkable maneuvers in American military history. Divisions that had been attacking east pivoted north without pause. Supply lines were reconfigured overnight. Artillery battalions changed positions while continuing to fire. Infantry regiments marched through ice storms, covering 20 miles per day, despite conditions that should have made movement impossible. By December 22nd, the day McAuliffe rejected the German surrender demand, Patton's 4th Armored Division had reached positions south of Bastogne. They faced 10 miles of German-controlled territory, defended by dug-in infantry, anti-tank guns, and the remnants of several panzer battalions. 10 miles. It might as well have been 100. The breakthrough attempt began on December 23rd. Sherman tanks, infantry riding in half-tracks, artillery support. Everything Patton could concentrate on a narrow front. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. For every 100 yards gained, the 4th Armored Division paid in blood. Tanks destroyed, infantry cut down, officers killed by sniper fire. The Germans had had 6 days to prepare their defenses, and they used that time efficiently. Every crossroads was mined. Every farmhouse concealed a machine gun nest. Every tree line masked an anti-tank gun. By December 24th, Christmas Eve, Patton's spearhead had advanced 3 miles. 7 miles remained. Inside Bastogne, ammunition levels were again critical. The aerial resupply had provided a temporary reprieve, but 4 days of intense combat had depleted those reserves. Medical supplies were exhausted. The aid stations had run out of morphine 2 days earlier, which meant soldiers with shattered limbs endured surgery with no anesthesia beyond whiskey and the leather belt clamped between their teeth. Henderson by this point had been continuously in combat for 8 days. He had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since December 18th. He had not eaten a hot meal since December 20th. His feet, which he had not removed from his boots in 6 days, had progressed beyond frostbite into the early stages of trench foot, the flesh swelling, splitting, beginning the slow rot that would eventually require amputation if left untreated. He did not care. None of them cared. They had held for 8 days against impossible odds, and they would hold for another 8 if necessary. McAuliffe had said nuts to the German surrender demand, and that word, ridiculous, undignified, perfect, had become a talisman. Nuts meant defiance. Nuts meant we will not break, we will not surrender, we will not give you the satisfaction of victory. Nuts meant you may kill us, but you will not defeat us. At 1645, on December 26th, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, drove his Sherman tank through the final German defensive line south of Bastogne. Behind him followed 37 more tanks and half-tracks carrying 600 infantrymen. They entered the town at 1700 hours, exactly 9 days after the encirclement began. Henderson saw them coming. He was still in his foxhole, the same position he had occupied for 9 days, when the first Sherman crested the ridge south of his position. For a moment, exhaustion and cold made him doubt his own senses. Then more tanks appeared, and half-tracks, and infantry marching in formation, and he understood. The siege was broken. Help had arrived. They had survived. The relief force brought everything the defenders needed: ammunition by the ton, medical supplies, food, winter clothing, and, perhaps most importantly, evidence that they had not been forgotten, that their sacrifice had meaning, that the nuts reply had bought time for Patton to arrive. The 101st Airborne had held Bastogne for 9 days against overwhelming odds. Those 9 days had disrupted the entire German offensive, delayed their advance, consumed resources they could not replace, and ultimately contributed to the failure of Hitler's last major offensive in the West. But the relief was not the end. The Germans, furious at the breakthrough, launched massive counterattacks over the following weeks. The fighting around Bastogne continued through January, brutal and unforgiving, as Wehrmacht forces tried to recapture the town they had nearly starved into submission. The 101st Airborne, despite exhaustion and heavy casualties, fought on. They had held once. They would hold again. Henderson was evacuated on January 3, 1945. Both his feet required amputation. The trench foot had progressed to gangrene during the siege, but medical supplies had been so scarce that triage protocols dictated treating only life-threatening injuries. Men with frostbitten feet were expected to walk, to fight, to hold their positions regardless of pain or permanent damage. He was transported to a field hospital in Luxembourg, where American doctors examined his feet with expressions of professional horror. "You walked on these?" one surgeon asked. "For how long?" Henderson, still adjusting to the concept of warmth and safety, answered honestly, "Since December 18th, 16 days." The surgeon's response was unprintable. What shocked Henderson more than the surgery, performed immediately without the weeks-long waiting list he had expected, was the quality of care. Anesthesia, real anesthesia, not whiskey and hope, clean surgical theaters, antibiotics, blood transfusions, post-operative recovery and actual hospital beds with clean sheets. The contrast with conditions in Bastogne was so extreme that Henderson initially wondered if he had died, and this was some peculiar version of heaven. The surgeon, a captain from Ohio named Morrison, explained while Henderson was coming out of anesthesia, "You're surprised by the immediate treatment? Don't be. This is standard protocol for combat casualties. The Army learned in North Africa that rapid intervention prevents deaths and saves limbs. We've got the best medical system in the world, Private. We just couldn't get it to you while you were surrounded. Henderson, groggy from morphine but conscious enough to register the irony, laughed until the surgical pain made him stop. The best medical system in the world. Maybe it was true. Certainly the treatment he received, immediate surgery, aggressive wound care, prosthetics fitted within weeks, exceeded anything available to German or Soviet soldiers in similar circumstances. But that excellence, Henderson realized, had been geographically contingent. Inside Bastogne during the siege, the best medical system in the world had been reduced to field amputations without anesthesia, triage decisions made with battlefield efficiency, and survival rates that depended more on luck than treatment. The system worked brilliantly when you could access it. When you were surrounded, outnumbered, and fighting for your life, the system's excellence became theoretical rather than practical. General McAuliffe received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership at Bastogne. The citation mentioned his extraordinary heroism and leadership and his inspired defense of the town. It did not mention the word nuts, though that single-word response had already entered American military mythology. The 101st Airborne Division received a Presidential Unit citation, only the second time in Army history that an entire division had been so honored. The citation praised their valor and determination and their magnificent stand. Again, no mention of nuts, though every soldier in the division knew that word had defined their experience more accurately than any formal military language could capture. Nuts was not polite. It was not diplomatic. It was not the kind of response military textbooks recommend when facing superior enemy forces. But it was honest, and it was American. And it perfectly captured the spirit that allowed 11,000 paratroopers to hold a frozen Belgian town against overwhelming odds. Years later, historians would debate whether the defense of Bastogne was militarily necessary. Could the Germans have bypassed the town? Would Hitler's offensive have failed regardless? The questions were academic. What mattered was not whether holding Bastogne was strategically optimal, but that American soldiers, when surrounded and offered the opportunity to surrender with honor, chose instead to fight. That choice, multiplied across 11,000 individual decisions to hold rather than yield, demonstrated something the Wehrmacht had not fully understood. American soldiers, for all their supposed softness and lack of martial tradition, could match German fanaticism with a peculiarly American form of stubbornness. The siege cost the 101st Airborne Division dearly. Casualties exceeded 3,000, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Another 2,000 suffered from frostbite severe enough to require medical evacuation. The division's effective combat strength, by the time they were finally relieved in January, had been reduced by nearly 50%, but they had held. And that word, nuts, had become synonymous with American military defiance, with the refusal to accept defeat even when defeat appeared inevitable. It was a one-word declaration that mathematics, logistics, and military science could not fully capture the human capacity for resistance. Henderson returned to Pennsylvania in March 1945. He arrived with 2 prosthetic feet, a Purple Heart, a combat infantryman badge, and memories that would take decades to process. His hometown organized a parade. The local newspaper ran a front-page story. Local hero returns from Bastogne. Well-meaning civilians thanked him for his service and asked what it had been like. Henderson never knew how to answer that question. How do you explain cold so intense it transforms flesh to stone? How do you describe fighting with 3 rounds in your rifle, knowing each shot might be your last? How do you convey the particular terror of artillery bombardment, the way the earth itself seems to betray you by channeling shrapnel and concussion into your body? Eventually, he settled on a standard response. We held. The general told them, nuts, and we held. This satisfied most questioners who appreciated the simplicity and the famous word. It did not, Henderson knew, convey the reality, the frozen feet, the gnawing hunger, the dying men in aid stations, the constant fear, the exhaustion so profound it became a form of madness. But reality, he discovered, was not what civilians wanted. They wanted heroes and victories and stories that made sense. Nuts gave them that story. It was heroic without being false, defiant without being boastful, memorable without requiring explanation, and perhaps, Henderson eventually concluded, that was enough. The full truth of Bastogne, the suffering, the randomness of survival, the men who died because a supply drop landed 200 yards left instead of on target, was too complex, too painful, too resistant to narrative simplification. Better to remember the word, better to remember that when the Germans demanded surrender, an American general told them no in the most American way possible. Better to remember that 11,000 paratroopers, cold and hungry and surrounded, chose to fight rather than yield. That, at least, was true. In the decades following World War II, the word nuts entered American cultural consciousness as shorthand for military defiance. It appeared in textbooks, in movies, in speeches by politicians invoking wartime courage. The 101st Airborne adopted it as an unofficial motto. Veterans of Bastogne signed letters with nuts instead of their names. General McAuliffe, who died in 1975, always insisted the response was not calculated heroism, but spontaneous frustration. "I was just annoyed," he told interviewers. "The Germans had surrounded us, bombarded us for days, and then had the nerve to demand we surrender. It made me mad, so I said what I was thinking." This modesty, characteristic of McAuliffe's personality, only enhanced the story's appeal. The best heroes, Americans decided, were reluctant ones. Henderson lived until 1998. He never attended reunions of the 101st Airborne, never joined veteran organizations, never spoke publicly about Bastogne beyond his standard response. "We held." The general told them, "Nuts," and we held. His family found after his death a single photograph from the war. McAuliffe's typed nuts response to the German surrender demand, carefully preserved in a frame. On the back, in Henderson's handwriting, "This is what it meant to us. This is why we stayed." The town of Bastogne erected a memorial to the American defenders. It includes a large stone inscribed with a single word, nuts. Tourists photograph it every day, often without fully understanding its significance. Local guides explain, an American general, when asked to surrender, replied with this word. It means no. Actually, it means more than no. It means defiance, contempt, the absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat appears inevitable. Military historians still study the siege of Bastogne. They analyze tactics, logistics, decision-making under pressure. They debate whether McAuliffe's refusal to surrender was brilliant or reckless, whether the defense was strategically necessary or merely symbolic. These debates will continue as long as military history is studied, but for the soldiers who lived through those 9 days in December 1944, the analysis was unnecessary. They knew what nuts meant. It meant, we will not break, we will not surrender. You may kill us, but you will not defeat us. It meant that sometimes in the depths of winter, surrounded by enemies cold and hungry and afraid, the only appropriate response to demands for submission is a single word of defiance. It meant, we are American soldiers, and we do not quit. That message, delivered in the crudest possible language, resonated across decades. Nuts became more than McAuliffe's reply to a German surrender demand. It became a statement about American character, about the stubborn refusal to accept the verdict of superior force, about the belief that sometimes courage and determination can overcome mathematics and firepower. Whether that belief is always justified remains debatable. But in Bastogne in December 1944, it proved true. 11,000 paratroopers held a frozen town against overwhelming odds because their general told the enemy no, told them in effect to go to hell. And because those paratroopers decided that their general's defiance deserved their support. The siege lasted 9 days. The word lasted forever.